Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and wanted to ask some questions of the author to make sure we have a clear understanding of this bill. This bill is not just limited to the border, correct? It has a full statewide impact. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, and it also applies to American citizens. It's not just people who are undocumented, correct?
To smugglers, yes.
So, well, it applies to any American citizen who could be arrested under this law, correct?
Who's a smuggler, yeah.
Okay, and one of the key issues that we've discussed relating to the bill is this really evisceration of judicial discretion. Can you tell us, because we elect judges to make determinations based on the facts before them, can you tell us why you think that our judges cannot fairly determine who deserves severe punishments and who doesn't?
The thrust of this bill is to set a mandatory minimum sentence for smugglers. I mean, that's the basic idea of the bill.
Right, but you're taking away a judge's power to determine, because normally they can determine how much time that they give to a defendant who's convicted under the statute, right? So why is it that we're taking away the judge's power to determine the punishment?
Because we want to make a deterrent. We want to deter people from smuggling, and so increasing the punishment and putting a mandatory minimum is our way of doing that.
But have you put any evidence before the committee or before this body that mandatory minimums are deterrents? Because isn't it true, in fact, that the federal government has dissuaded mandatory minimums, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
Well, let me ask you this, because also we want to get an understanding of how it works. So let's say that you have a preacher or a priest who's picking up individuals for a church service, and some of them happen to be undocumented. Can you tell us how folks in this particular situation are protected from a 10-year mandatory minimum jail time? How would the preacher be protected?
So, first of all, we're not changing the definition of smuggling. And so whoever it is that would get charged for smuggling after this bill passes would also be subject to it before this bill were to pass. And so you talk about a priest potentially getting charged. Well, in order to get charged, a person, or in order to get convicted of smuggling, a person would have to commit an offense, would have to encourage or induce a person to enter or remain in this country in violation of federal law. And this is already in statute. This is not in the bill. So they'd first have to encourage or induce a person to enter or remain in this country in violation of federal law. They'd also have to conceal, harbor, or shield a person from detection. And then they would have to do those things knowingly. And so there's already a high bar, in my opinion, in statute to convict somebody or to pursue charges against somebody for smuggling.
And the part that you're referring to is subsection 2 of section 20.05 of the Penal Code, but there's also another section under 20.05 subsection 1 that says a person commits an offense if the person knowingly uses a motor vehicle, and there's another section, so they could technically be charged for driving somebody. A priest could be charged for driving a van load of folks who don't have papers to mass. Is that correct?
No, I don't. Not if they had to have knowingly. If they unknowingly are transporting somebody to the store or something like that.
Let's say they're knowingly transporting a person that doesn't have papers.
They'd have to knowingly.
You have a priest who is knowingly transporting somebody that they know doesn't have papers and is taking them to mass. They could be charged under the smuggling statute and get 10 years mandatory minimum jail time. Is that correct?
Well, if you're correct, they could be charged today. They could have been charged 10 years ago. They could have been charged last year for that. We're not doing that we're not changing that in this bill.
Right, but what you are changing is the 10-year mandatory minimum. And so that's our point, that if you have a priest who's driving somebody, let me give you another example. You have an Uber driver who's picking up somebody who's undocumented and they don't know they're undocumented. Would they be convicted? Would they face a 10-year jail time?
Absolutely not. I mean, it would be very, very difficult to prosecute someone like that who didn't know what they were doing.
What if you have a good Samaritan who is prosecuting somebody or who is driving somebody, they're trying to help them, pick them up on the side of the road, and that individual doesn't have papers, would they be facing the 10-year?
If they would, you'd have heard about the story already, because that's the statute is already there. That the language in the statute is already there. This bill doesn't change that.
But there's no language protecting good Samaritans though, right?
Yes, there's the, let me see here. There's two sections in the code that deal with necessity. There's one that deals with necessity and another one that deals with duress. These are, again, already in the code, not touched by this bill. And so those chapters, those sections of the code would help folks like what you're talking about.
Okay, let me ask you this. What if an individual is taking somebody who they know is undocumented, doesn't have papers, to the doctor? Could they be charged? They're knowingly taking them, knowing they don't have papers. They can be charged and face a 10-year mandatory minimum jail sentence, correct?
I believe the section on necessity would keep them from being charged.
What if they're taking them
convicted.
to class that may not be viewed as a necessity instead of the doctor? They could face a 10-year jail time?
The way I read it, they would still need to, not only knowingly, they would also need to encourage or induce the person to enter or remain in the country, and they'd also have to conceal, harbor, or shield them. And so, yeah, if they meet all of those criteria, then yeah, they can get charged.
Okay, let me ask you this, because your bill also applies to a stash house, correct?
Right.
And a stash house, the statute refers to uses or permits another to use any real estate, building, room, tent, vehicle, boat, or other property owned by the person or under that person's control to commit these offenses. So could somebody who is renting to somebody that knows doesn't have papers be charged with the stash house and faces 10-year mandatory minimum penalty?
I think a prosecutor would have to prove that they knowingly concealed, harbored, or shielded, or that they knowingly encouraged or induced them to stay.
And if they do that, they'll face 10 years mandatory minimum jail time under your bill, correct?
If they did that, they would currently be subject to the crime of smuggling. And yes, under this bill, we would elevate the penalty.
Okay, and let me ask you this, because as you know, we don't have a mandatory minimum jail time for murder. We don't have a mandatory minimum jail time for rape. And the federal government doesn't even provide as nearly a harsh penalty. In fact, the U.S. Sentencing Commission says the federal government issues on average around a 15-month sentences for smuggling. So the 10-year sentence seems really arbitrary. Can you tell us how you decided that it would be 10 years and not 7 years or 5 years or 3 years?
It was, first of all, it started with the governor's emergency item at the beginning of the regular session. And so that was the inspiration of it, and we drafted the bill from there.
So the governor said 10 years?
He was proposing a 10-year minimum, yes. And so we started with that idea, and we've been working with stakeholders and members of both chambers since.
So, and there's no mandatory minimum for murder, so can you tell us what the logic is in saying that this offense is worse than murder?
There's plenty of other mandatory minimums in the law.
But not for murder.
I'm not sure about murder, but there is
not.
something, I think sexual assault, there's several others, I think.
Thank you.